like an unwanted guest, turning the glittering ballroom into a suffocating cage of silk, champagne, and desperation. Inside, 200 members of London's finest society pretended the cold didn't exist, dancing and laughing with the brittle gaiety of people who knew the season's marriage market waited for no one. The air was thick with the competing scents of hothouse roses, expensive perfume, and the particular anxiety that came with knowing one's matrimonial value was being calculated with every glance. Lady Laura Garcia stood near the refreshment table, her champagne untouched, her mind cataloguing escape routes with the same precision she applied to her father's estate correspondence. At 22, she had survived 3 seasons by perfecting the art of strategic invisibility, standing just close enough to groups to appear social, just far enough to avoid actual conversation. It was a delicate balance, and tonight, it was failing spectacularly. Because Earl Thornsby was approaching. She'd seen him circling for the past hour, his trajectory growing more determined with each circuit of the ballroom. At 43, Lord Thornsby was precisely the kind of suitor Laura's mother considered distinguished, which was maternal code for wealthy, titled, and utterly indifferent to whether his prospective bride had thoughts of her own. His cravat was already loosened, his face flushed with the kind of ruddy enthusiasm that came from too much brandy, and too much confidence in his own appeal. "Lady Laura." His voice carried the wet, heavy quality of someone who'd been sampling the punch bowl with alarming frequency. "I've been seeking you all evening." The scent of brandy hit her like a physical wall. Laura's smile remained fixed, but her mind was already racing through possibilities. The retiring room was too obvious. The garden was too cold and too compromising. The library would trap her in a corner with a man whose idea of intellectual discourse involved lengthy monologues about his hunting exploits. "Lord Thornsby," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "How kind of you to say so." He moved closer, and Laura took an involuntary step backward, her spine meeting the edge of the refreshment table. "I've spoken with your father. He's amenable to a courtship. Very amenable indeed." Thornsby's hand reached for hers, and Laura saw her future crystallizing with horrible clarity. A lifetime of being someone's decorative possession, value for her dowry and connections while her mind slowly atrophied from disuse. "My lord, I'm feeling rather faint." "The heat?" "Then let me escort you to the garden for air." His grip on her wrist was firm, proprietary, and entirely too confident. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, the ballroom continued its glittering performance, oblivious to her panic. In that moment, watching Thornsby's self-satisfied smile, something inside her snapped. 3 years of strategic invisibility, of careful social maneuvering, of pretending to be less intelligent than she was to make men comfortable, all of it suddenly felt unbearable. She had approximately 3 seconds to make a decision that would either save or ruin her. Laura chose ruin. She pulled her wrist free with a sharp twist that made Thornsby blink in surprise. Then she did what no proper lady would ever do at the Peton ball. She ran. Not a ladylike glide toward the retiring room, but an actual run, her silk skirts gathered in both hands, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Behind her, she heard Thornsby's confused exclamation, her mother's horrified gasp, the sudden hush that fell over the nearest clusters of guests. But Laura didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She burst through the French doors into the freezing December night. The temperature dropped so sudden and severe it stole her breath. The fog swallowed her immediately, transforming the familiar courtyard into an alien landscape of shadows and uncertain shapes. Her evening slippers skidded on frost-slit cobblestones as she fled down the steps, her breath coming in visible clouds, her mind blank except for the singular imperative to get away. Carriages lined the drive, their drivers huddled together for warmth, their passengers still inside enjoying Lord Pethan's legendary hospitality. Laura didn't think, didn't plan. She simply grabbed the handle of the nearest carriage and yanked the door open, throwing herself inside with all the grace of a woman who'd just set fire to her social reputation. The door slammed shut behind her. Laura collapsed against the velvet seat, her chest heaving, her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins. For one blessed moment, she was alone in the dark, safe from Thornsby's brandy-soaked persistence and her mother's matrimonial ambitions. Then someone across from her laughed. Not a shocked gasp or a scandalized exclamation, but genuine, delighted laughter, bright and musical and entirely unexpected. Laura's eyes, adjusting to the darkness, made out the shape of another woman sitting in the opposite seat. As her vision cleared, she saw a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, with dark eyes that sparkled with mischief and a smile that suggested she found Laura's dramatic entrance absolutely fascinating. "Well," the woman said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of the highest aristocracy mixed with something warmer, more human. "That was the most interesting thing to happen at a Pethan ball in 3 years. I'm Lady Llywelyn, and judging by your expression, you've just made either the best or worst decision of your life." She leaned forward, her smile widening. "So tell me, mystery woman who hijacks carriages, are you running from something or towards something? Because depending on your answer, I might be able to help you with both." Laura stared at her, still breathless, still terrified, but suddenly, inexplicably hopeful. Outside, she could hear voices calling her name, the commotion of her disappearance spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. Inside this stolen carriage, illuminated only by the faint glow of the carriage lamps, sat a woman who looked at her fleeing figure not with judgment, but with fascination. "Running from," Laura admitted, her voice shaking. "Definitely running from." "Earl Thornsby?" Lurd guessed with the confidence of someone who had seen this particular drama play out before. At Laura's shocked nod, she laughed again. "Oh, you poor thing. He cornered my friend Beatrice last month. She had to pretend to twist her ankle just to escape." Lurd settled back against her seat, studying Laura with open curiosity. "But you didn't twist your ankle. You ran. In front of everyone. Which means either you're desperate, brave, or brilliantly calculating." Her eyes narrowed with appreciation. "Possibly all three." "Desperate," Laura said weakly. "Definitely desperate." "Good." Lurd's smile turned conspiratorial, and Laura felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation or might have been pure terror. "Because I need someone desperate. Someone brave enough to take social risks. Someone who understands that sometimes the proper way of doing things is absolutely the wrong way." She extended her hand across the carriage, the gesture both formal and wildly inappropriate given the circumstances. "Lady Laura Garcia, I presume? Your reputation precedes you. Brilliant mind, manages your father's correspondence, passionate about architectural history, and apparently willing to commit social suicide to avoid Earl Thornsby." Laura took her hand, too shocked to question how this stranger knew so much about her. "How did you?" "I make it my business to know interesting people," Lurd interrupted smoothly. "And you, Lady Laura, are about to become very interesting indeed." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the particular excitement of someone about to propose something thoroughly inadvisable. "I have a brother, Martin Yohe, Duke of Ashbourne. He's brilliant, passionate about architectural history, completely opposed to the traditional marriage market, and absolutely impossible to matchmake because he can spot manipulation from a mile away. Her smile turned wicked. Which is why I need someone authentic. Someone genuine. Someone who actually shares his interests and isn't just pretending for the sake of a title. Laura's mind, still reeling from her escape, struggled to catch up. You want to matchmake me? With your brother? A duke? I want to give you both a chance, Lurd corrected. Martin needs someone who sees beyond the title. You need someone who values your mind. And she paused, something vulnerable flickering across her features. I need Martin to trust my judgment enough to approve my own choice of husband. Lord Philip Ravenswood. A wonderful man Martin considers unsuitable because Philip's fortune is in trade rather than land. She reached across and gripped Laura's hands. Help me, and I'll help you. We'll arrange a chance meeting at the Architectural Symposium next week. You'll meet Martin naturally, authentically, as intellectual equals. If there's genuine compatibility, it will develop on its own. If not, we've lost nothing. It was mad. Manipulative. Exactly the kind of scheme that could explode spectacularly in all their faces. It was also, Laura realized with sudden, crystal clarity, the most interesting proposition she'd received in 3 years of enduring the marriage market's soul-crushing tedium. Outside, the voices searching for her were growing closer. Inside, Lady Lurd Yohi watched her with the intensity of someone who recognized a kindred spirit, another woman willing to bend society's rules in pursuit of something real. Laura Garcia, who had just committed social suicide by running from Earl Thornsby, who managed complex estate correspondence while pretending to be merely decorative, who loved architectural history more than any accomplishment approved for ladies, made her second reckless decision of the night. Tell me about this symposium, she said. Lurd's answering smile was brilliant, conspiratorial, and promised either disaster or destiny. Possibly both. Oh, my dear new friend, she said, reaching over to adjust Laura's disheveled hair with the easy confidence of someone who just recruited a co-conspirator. Let me tell you about my impossible, brilliant, absolutely perfect brother, and the very strategic way you're going to accidentally meet him. Outside, London's December fog continued to press against the windows, but inside the wrong carriage, 2 women began plotting the kind of matchmaking scheme that would either end in triumph or spectacular ruin. Laura, still breathless from her escape, found she didn't particularly care which. After 3 years of proper behavior and strategic invisibility, ruin sounded almost refreshing. The carriage lurched into motion, and Laura realized with a start that they were leaving, actually departing from Peton House, while her name was probably being whispered in scandalized tones throughout the ballroom. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly liberated, as though running from Thornsby had severed some invisible tether that had been holding her in place for 3 years. Lurd settled back against the velvet cushions, with the satisfied air of someone who just won an excellent hand at cards. Before we discuss Martin and symposiums and strategic meetings, you need to understand something about my brother. He's not like other dukes. Most people say that about men who turn out to be exactly like other men, Laura said, then immediately regretted the cynicism. But Lurd laughed, delighted. Oh, I like you already. But no, I mean it quite literally. Martin inherited the title at 19 when our father died. He was brilliant, passionate about Gothic architecture, absolutely determined to use his position for something meaningful. And instead, her voice turned bitter. Instead, he became consumed by duty. Every decision filtered through what's proper for a duke. Every relationship evaluated for political advantage. Every conversation carefully managed to maintain the dignity of the Ashbourne name. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "He's suffocating, Laura. And worse, he's suffocating me along with him." Laura thought of her own father, well-meaning but convinced that a woman's intelligence was best deployed in managing household accounts rather than anything more substantial. The overprotective brother. Overprotective doesn't begin to cover it. When Philip, Lord Ravenswood, first expressed interest in courting me, Martin investigated his entire family history, his business dealings, even interviewed 3 of his former associates. He concluded that a man whose fortune comes from importing textiles rather than ancient land holdings is unsuitable for a duke's sister. Lourdes' hands clenched in her lap. "Never mind that Philip is kind, intelligent, shares my passion for music, and treats me like a person rather than a decorative asset. None of that matters to Martin, because Philip doesn't fit the proper aristocratic mold. So you're hoping if Martin finds love himself, if Martin finds genuine connection with someone outside the traditional channels, maybe he'll understand that compatibility matters more than propriety. That real partnership is worth more than strategic alliance." Lourdes pulled a small card from her reticule. "The Royal Society is hosting a symposium on medieval cathedral construction next Thursday. Martin will be there. He never misses these events. They're the only place he lets himself be genuinely passionate about something other than duty." Laura took the card, her heart beginning to race. "And you want me to just happen to attend? I want you to be yourself. Talk about architecture, share your insights, let Martin see your brilliant mind in action. No simpering, no pretending to be less intelligent than you are, no strategic positioning near the refreshments hoping to catch his eye." Lourdes' smile turned mischievous. "Though I may have mentioned to Martin that a Lady Garcia recently published a fascinating paper on Norman stonework techniques. He's been quite curious about meeting you." "You didn't." "I absolutely did. Which means when you accidentally attend the same symposium, he'll be expecting someone formidable." She reached across and gripped Laura's hand. "All I'm asking is that you be honest. If there's no connection, we've wasted an afternoon. But if there is," her voice softened with something like hope, "if there is, maybe we both get what we want. You get someone who values your mind. Martin gets someone who sees beyond his title. And I get my brother back from the prison of propriety he's built around himself." Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing London's gaslit streets. Laura looked down at the symposium card, at this chance for something real, and thought about Earl Thornby's brandy-soaked persistence and her mother's desperate matchmaking and 3 years of pretending to be decorative rather than intelligent. "Thursday," she said quietly. "I'll be there." Lourdes' smile was brilliant and conspiratorial and promised either disaster or destiny. Laura was beginning to think she didn't mind which. The invitation arrived the next morning, delivered by a footman in the Ashbourne livery before Laura's mother had even finished cataloguing the previous night's social disaster. Lady Lourdes Yohe requested the pleasure of Lady Laura Garcia's company for tea at Ashbourne House that afternoon. The heavy cardstock and ducal seal made the invitation impossible to refuse, even for a mother still mortified by her daughter's theatrical exit from the Peton ball. "Perhaps the Duke's sister didn't witness your episode," her mother said hopefully, though her tone suggested she knew better. "Do try to behave with some decorum, Laura. We can't afford any more spectacles." Laura said nothing, but her fingers traced the embossed crest as her mind raced with possibilities and apprehensions in equal measure. Ashbourne House was everything Laura had imagined and nothing she'd expected. The exterior was imposing, all Portland stone, and classical proportions designed to intimidate, but the moment Lourdes swept her past the formal receiving rooms into a private sitting room, the atmosphere transformed entirely. Books overflowed from shelves onto every available surface. Architectural drawings covered one entire wall. A half-finished musical composition lay scattered across the pianoforte.
"Martin thinks I'm hopelessly disorganized,"
Lourdes said, following Laura's gaze with obvious affection.
"He's not wrong, but at least my chaos is honest. His study is perfectly arranged, every document filed with military precision, every book alphabetized. It's exhausting just looking at it."
She gestured Laura toward a comfortable chair near the fire.
"Tea first, conspiracy second. I'm civilized enough for that much."
The tea was excellent, and Laura found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. Lourdes had that rare gift of making people feel immediately at ease, as though they'd been friends for years rather than co-conspirators for less than 12 hours.
"I've been thinking about our conversation,"
Lourdes said once they were settled, her tone shifting from casual to strategic.
"If you're going to meet Martin authentically, you need to understand what you're walking into. He's not deliberately difficult, but 3 years of being a duke has made him guarded. You're giving me intelligence,"
Laura said slowly,
"about your own brother." "I'm giving you context,"
Lourdes corrected.
"The same context I'd want if I were meeting someone new. Martin presents himself one way in society, but that's armor, not authenticity."
She leaned forward, her expression earnest.
"Here's what you need to know. Martin cares desperately about legacy, but not in the way most aristocrats do. He wants to leave something meaningful, something that matters beyond just maintaining the family name. That's why architecture obsesses him. It's permanent, purposeful, beautiful."
Laura set down her teacup, listening intently as Lourdes continued.
"He's also lonely, though he'd never admit it. Every conversation in society is a performance. Every potential match is evaluated through the lens of duty and propriety rather than genuine connection. He's convinced himself that's enough, that partnership should be strategic rather than passionate."
Lourdes' voice softened.
"But I've seen him at these symposiums, Laura. Seen him come alive when talking about flying buttresses and medieval masonry. That's the real Martin, the one who gets excited about ideas, who values intelligence over pedigree, who just wants someone to see him as more than a title. And if he discovers this meeting was orchestrated, then we'll have failed spectacularly, and he'll never trust my judgment again,"
Lourdes said with brutal honesty.
"Which is why everything depends on authenticity. I can give you the map to his personality, but you have to walk the path yourself. No pretending, no manufactured compatibility. If the connection isn't genuine, it's not worth pursuing."
She reached into a small writing desk and withdrew a folded paper.
"Martin will be presenting on Westminster Abbey's Henry VII Chapel, specifically the pendant vaulting technique. He's been researching it for months. If you have thoughts on late perpendicular Gothic, he'll be thrilled. If you don't, for God's sake don't pretend. He can smell manufactured interest from across a room."
Laura took the paper, scanning Lourdes' notes, topics Martin was passionate about, subjects that made him defensive, the particular way he deflected when conversations became too personal. It was remarkably detailed, almost invasive in its thoroughness.
"You really do want this to work,"
Laura said quietly.
"I want my brother to be happy,"
Lourdes replied.
"And I want him to understand that happiness doesn't always follow society's prescribed path. If you two are genuinely compatible, wonderful. If not, perhaps watching you be authentically yourself will remind him that real connection is worth more than strategic alliance."
She paused, then added with characteristic honesty.
"And yes, if he falls for someone I introduced him to, someone outside his usual circles, maybe he'll be more amenable to Philip."
Laura looked at the notes, at this carefully drawn map of a man she'd never met, and felt the weight of what she was agreeing to. This wasn't just attending a symposium. It was stepping into someone's life with information he hadn't chosen to share, armed with insights that gave her an unfair advantage.
"I'll go Thursday,"
she said finally.
"But Lord, if this feels wrong, if the manipulation starts to outweigh the genuine connection, I'll tell him everything. I won't build something real on a foundation of deception."
Lurd studied her for a long moment, then smiled, not the conspiratorial grin from the carriage, but something warmer, more genuine.
"That's exactly why I chose you, Laura. You have a conscience. Martin deserves someone with a conscience."
She raised her teacup in an ironic toast.
"To honest manipulation and authentic conspiracies. May we all get exactly what we deserve."
Laura clinked her cup against Lurd's, laughing despite herself at the absurdity of it all. Outside, London continued its proper, predictable routines. Inside Ashbourne House, two women plotted the kind of interference that would either forge genuine love or explode spectacularly in all their faces. Thursday suddenly felt very close indeed. The Royal Society's lecture hall smelled of old wood, dusty books, and the particular mustiness that came from housing centuries of accumulated knowledge. Laura arrived early, clutching her notebook like a shield, Lurd's carefully prepared notes burning a hole in her reticule. She'd read them 3 times that morning, memorizing Martin's preferences and conversational patterns until she could recite them backwards. Now, standing in the slowly filling auditorium, the whole enterprise felt suddenly, terrifyingly fraudulent. She was about to meet a man with insider information he hadn't consented to share. It was strategic, calculated, and exactly the kind of manipulation she'd spent 3 years watching other women deploy in the marriage market with ruthless efficiency. The difference, she told herself firmly, was that she wouldn't pretend. She wouldn't manufacture opinions or feign interests she didn't possess. If they connected, it would be genuine, regardless of how the meeting was arranged. The rationalization felt thin even to her own ears.
"Excuse me, is this seat taken?"
Laura looked up and forgot how to breathe. The man standing beside her was tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it while reading, and eyes that were startlingly intelligent behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore his formal attire with the slight awkwardness of someone who'd rather be in shirt sleeves examining architectural drawings. There was ink on his right cuff, and what looked suspiciously like limestone dust on his waistcoat. This was the Duke of Ashbourne, the overprotective brother, the man she was supposedly here to accidentally meet. He looked nothing like the rigid aristocrat Lurd had described, and everything like someone who'd gotten genuinely excited about medieval architecture and forgotten to be ducal about it.
"No,"
Laura managed.
"Please."
He sat, immediately pulling out his own notebook, dog-eared, filled with sketches and margin notes in handwriting so dense it was nearly illegible.
"Martin Yohe,"
he said absently, then seemed to remember himself.
"That is, the Duke of Ashbourne,"
Laura finished.
"Yes, I know. Your sister mentioned you might be here."
Something flickered across his face, wariness, perhaps, or resignation.
"Lurd has been enthusiastically promotional lately. If she's been matchmaking again, I apologize. She means well, but she said you'd publish thoughts on Westminster's fan vaulting,"
Laura interrupted, surprised by her own boldness.
"and that you might be interested in discussing Norman stonework techniques." She didn't mention anything about matchmaking.
It was technically true. Lurd had been far too sophisticated to call it matchmaking outright. Martin's expression shifted from wary to interested.
"You're Lady Garcia. The paper on Norwich Cathedral's drainage systems. I've read it twice. Your theory about the original Norman construction being designed to accommodate future expansion was brilliant.
Laura felt heat rise to her cheeks.
You've read my work? Of course. Anyone serious about medieval architecture has read it. Your analysis of the water channeling beneath the crossing tower solved a debate that's been ongoing for 20 years.
He leaned forward, his reserve crumbling with obvious enthusiasm.
Though I did wonder about your conclusion regarding the eastern chapels. Did you consider that the drainage might have been modified during the perpendicular renovations rather than being part of the original design?
And just like that, Lourdes's carefully prepared script evaporated from Laura's mind entirely. Because Martin wasn't asking the polite, performative questions men usually directed at her. He was genuinely engaging with her work, challenging her conclusions, with the kind of intellectual respect she'd been craving for 3 years.
The eastern chapels are fascinating,
she said, flipping open her notebook with suddenly steady hands.
But if you look at the foundation depth and the angle of the original channels, the modifications would have been impossible without completely destabilizing the crossing tower. Which means the perpendicular builders were working with infrastructure already in place.
Martin finished, his eyes lighting up.
My God, that's elegant. The original Norman architects were planning 300 years ahead. Or they simply understood water management better than we give them credit for. Which is even more impressive, given the tools available at the time.
They were leaning toward each other now, notebooks open between them, the symposium's official start time approaching unnoticed. Laura sketched a quick diagram of Norwich's foundation system, and Martin immediately added annotations, his handwriting as chaotic as his thoughts were precise.
What about Westminster?
Laura asked.
Your sister mentioned you've been researching the Henry VII Chapel. The pendant vaulting,
Martin said, and something in his voice shifted, pure passion replacing academic interest.
Everyone focuses on how it looks, but the engineering is what's remarkable. The weight distribution, the way the stone seems to defy gravity, it's not magic, it's mathematics. Precise, beautiful mathematics rendered in limestone.
He pulled out a detailed sketch he'd clearly drawn himself, pointing to stress points and load-bearing structures with fingers that trembled slightly with excitement. Laura found herself drawn into his enthusiasm, asking questions not from Lourdes's carefully prepared list, but from genuine curiosity about the technical challenges medieval architects had solved.
The thing is,
Martin said, his formal reserve completely abandoned now.
Everyone treats these buildings like art, which they are, but they're also incredibly sophisticated engineering. These men were solving problems we still struggle with today, and they were doing it with rope, pulleys, and empirical observation rather than computational analysis. They were brilliant,
Laura agreed.
And we've spent centuries admiring the aesthetics while ignoring the genius of the structural solutions. Exactly.
Martin's face was animated in a way that made him look younger, less burdened.
That's exactly it. You understand. Most people don't understand.
The symposium's moderator called for attention, and they both jumped slightly, as though remembering they were in public. Martin glanced at Laura, something almost vulnerable in his expression.
Would you?
He paused, seeming to gather courage.
After the presentations, would you be willing to continue this discussion? Perhaps over tea? There's a matter concerning the cathedral at Wells I've been puzzling over, and your perspective on foundation engineering would be invaluable.
Laura thought about Lourdes's conspiracy, about the notes in her reticule detailing Martin's preferences and conversational patterns. She thought about the strategic nature of this meeting, and the guilt that had been gnawing at her since accepting the invitation. Then she looked at Martin, genuinely excited about medieval drainage systems, ink-stained and disheveled, and treating her like an intellectual equal rather than a potential duchess, and made a decision.
"I'd like that,"
she said honestly.
"very much."
His smile was brilliant and unguarded, and made her forget, just for a moment, that this entire meeting had been orchestrated. Because sitting beside her wasn't the Duke of Ashbourne with his title and duties, and careful aristocratic reserve. It was just Martin, passionate about architecture and starved for genuine connection, looking at her like she was the first person in years who'd actually seen him. The script was forgotten, the strategy abandoned, and Laura realized with equal parts exhilaration and terror that whatever was sparking between them had nothing to do with Luard's conspiracy, and everything to do with two minds that worked in complementary harmony. Which meant when he inevitably discovered the manipulation, he'd have every right to hate her for it. The thought should have stopped her. Instead, when Martin leaned closer to share his notes during the first presentation, Laura found herself leaning back, genuine interest overriding guilty conscience. She'd worry about the deception later. Right now, she had medieval architecture to discuss with the first man who'd ever valued her mind over her dowry. Everything else could wait. The symposium's midday interval was less of a break and more of a tactical maneuver for the elite. While the scholars debated in the hall, the gentlemen enthusiasts gathered in the foyer to trade influence. Laura spotted Martin immediately. He was backed into a corner near a towering marble bust of Socrates, looking very much like he wished the philosopher would come to life and provide a distraction. Standing before him was Lord Wetherby, a man whose reputation for being the most tedious orator in the House of Lords was matched only by the sheer volume of his voice.
"And I told the board, Ashbourne, that if we don't prioritize the aesthetic over the structural, we shall lose the very soul of the empire."
Wetherby's finger was jabbed inches from Martin's chest.
"You agree, don't you? A duke of your standing must see that the foundation is secondary to the facade."
Martin's face was a mask of ducal endurance, but Laura saw the tightening of his jaw and the way his thumb rhythmically brushed the edge of his notebook, a nervous habit Luard had mentioned in her notes. He was being held hostage by politeness. Laura took a steadying breath. Be authentic, she reminded herself.
"Lord Wetherby, I do hope I'm not interrupting,"
Laura said, gliding into the conversation with a bright, purposeful smile.
"But I simply had to find the Duke. Your Grace, the curator from the British Museum is inquiring about the Norman blueprints we discussed earlier. He seemed quite insistent that only you could clarify the discrepancy in the Eastern transept."
Wetherby blinked, his monologue derailed.
"The Eastern transept? Surely that can wait, my dear." "I'm afraid not,"
Martin interjected, his voice carrying a note of profound relief that he didn't quite hide quickly enough.
"Scientific accuracy waits for no man, Wetherby. You'll excuse us?"
Before the older man could protest, Martin had offered Laura his arm and steered her away through the crowd. They didn't head for the curator. Instead, Martin guided her toward a secluded, shadow-drenched alcove behind a heavy velvet curtain, far from the prying eyes of the ton. The silence of the alcove was sudden and heavy. The air here was cooler, smelling of old stone and the faint, woodsy scent of Martin's cologne.
"There is no curator, is there?"
Martin asked, though he was smiling, a real, lopsided smile that reached his eyes.
"Not a single one,"
Laura admitted, her heart doing a strange fluttering dance.
"But I couldn't watch a man who understands the importance of a foundation listen to a lecture on the virtues of a facade any longer. It felt sacrilegious."
Martin laughed softly, leaning his shoulder against the cold stone wall. The shadows of the alcove made the space feel incredibly intimate, stripping away the titles of Duke and Lady.
"Thank you, Laura. Truly. Weathered has a way of making one feel as though they are drowning in lukewarm tea.
He looked down at his hands, then back at her, his expression turning uncharacteristically vulnerable.
Lurd told me I should expect someone formidable when I met you. But I didn't expect someone who actually sees the person behind the escape attempt.
Laura felt a sharp pang of guilt at the mention of Lurd, but it was eclipsed by the intensity of Martin's gaze. For a moment, he wasn't the impenetrable Duke or the
overprotective brother.
He was just a man who felt out of place in his own world, finding a brief sanctuary in a dark corner with the only person who understood why.
I know what it's like,
Laura whispered, stepping slightly closer.
To have to play a part while your mind is miles away, solving problems no one else even knows exist.
Martin reached out, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve.
It is a lonely business, being a decorative asset or a pillar of the state. I haven't had a conversation this honest in. I can't remember when.
In the dim light, the distance between them seemed to vanish. The strategic information Laura possessed felt heavy in her mind, but the warmth of his hand near hers was real. For a heartbeat, the conspiracy was forgotten, replaced by the raw, quiet connection of two people finally being seen. The morning sun through the windows of the Garcia estate was far too bright for Laura's mood. On her desk lay a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with the Ashbourne seal. It wasn't a note from Lurd this time. It was a formal request from Martin, the Duke himself, asking her father for permission to call on her that afternoon. When Martin arrived, he wasn't the ink-stained scholar from the symposium or the vulnerable man from the alcove. He was every bit the Duke, impeccably dressed, his posture a testament to centuries of Ashbourne pride. Yet, when he looked at Laura, the rigid ducal mask softened into something terrifyingly tender.
"I brought you something,"
he said softly, after the formal greetings were concluded, and they were settled in the morning room. He handed her a small, leather-bound volume. It was a rare, first-edition treatise on the vaulted ceilings of Gloucester Cathedral.
"I remembered you mentioned the masonry there was particularly innovative. I spent 3 hours in my library this morning looking for it."
Laura took the book, its aged leather worn from his hands.
"Martin, it's too much. I can't possibly. It's not enough,"
he interrupted, his voice dropping to a private register. He leaned forward, ignoring the tea tray between them.
"Laura, for years, I have walked through these rooms and attended these functions as if I were a ghost. People see the title, they see the influence, but they never see the man. Until you."
He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the table.
"You knew about my paper before I even spoke. You understood my frustrations with the facade of our society without me having to explain them. It's as if you had a map to my very soul."
The word map hit Laura like a physical blow. She thought of the folded paper in her reticule upstairs, Lurd's intelligence report. Every spontaneous connection they had made was a path already cleared for her. Martin was opening his heart with a purity and earnestness that made her feel like a common thief.
"Martin, I'm not as perfect as you think,"
she stammered, the guilt beginning to feel like a leaden weight in her chest.
"You are honest,"
he said, misinterpreting her hesitation for modesty.
"In a world built on strategic alliances and manufactured charm, you are the only thing that feels real to me. My sister, for all her faults, was right about you. She told me you were formidable, but she didn't say you were the most genuine person I would ever meet."
Watching the light of absolute trust in his eyes, Laura felt the walls of the matchmaking conspiracy closing in. He wasn't falling for a character. He was falling for a woman he believed had found him by chance. Every smile he gave her was a debt she couldn't repay, and every kind word was a reminder that their entire foundation was built on a lie orchestrated by a sister he didn't even trust. She realized then that Lourdes was wrong. This wasn't honest manipulation. It was a betrayal of the very intellectual equality they both prized. "I have to tell you something," Laura began, her voice trembling. But at that moment, her father entered the room, beaming at the prospect of a ducal son-in-law, and the opportunity for truth vanished into the shadows of propriety. The following morning, Laura didn't wait for an invitation. She arrived at Ashbourne House, with the leather-bound treatise on Gloucester Cathedral clutched to her chest like a shield. She found Lourdes in the music room, looking triumphantly pleased as she reviewed a guest list for an upcoming garden party.
"Laura, you look like you've seen a ghost,"
Lourdes cried, her smile widening.
"Or perhaps just a duke in love. My brother's valet says Martin hasn't stopped humming since he returned from your home yesterday. It's working, Laura. The plan is flawless." "It's not flawless, Lourdes. It's dishonest,"
Laura said, her voice sharp enough to make the other woman pause. She set the book down on the mahogany table.
"He gave me this. He spent hours searching for it because he thought our connection was a stroke of divine luck. He looks at me with such absolute sincerity, and all I see is the map you gave me."
Lourdes stood, her expression shifting from delight to a defensive coolness.
"I gave you a head start, Laura. That's all. Most women in London would kill for the intelligence I handed you on a silver platter. I am not most women, and Martin is not just any suitor."
Laura stepped forward, her hands trembling.
"He is a man who prizes integrity above all else. He hates manipulation, Lourdes. He's spent his whole life being managed by advisors and sycophants. I won't be another person who manages him. And what is the alternative?"
Lourdes' voice rose.
"You back out now? You break his heart just as he's finally starting to breathe again? If you leave him, he'll retreat back into that shell of duty, and I will be stuck here, watching him wither while he denies me my own happiness with Philip. I want you to be happy, but not at the cost of his trust,"
Laura countered.
"I'm done with the strategic info gathering. No more notes on his favorite poets, no more tips on which architectural debates to bring up. If we are to have a future, it has to be based on what I actually know of him, not what you've whispered in my ear."
Lourdes paced the room, the silk of her skirts hissing against the floor.
"You're being naive. The world doesn't work on pure connections. It works on leverage and preparation. I am trying to save us both from a lifetime of boredom and overbearing brothers. By making me a liar?"
Laura shook her head.
"If he asks me how I knew to be at that symposium, or how I knew his secret thoughts on the Gothic revival, what am I supposed to say? I won't do it anymore, Lourdes. I'm going to tell him."
Lourdes froze, her face turning pale.
"If you tell him now, he'll see it as a conspiracy. He won't just be angry with me, he'll be devastated by you. He finally thinks he's found a kindred spirit. Do you really want to be the one to tell him that his kindred spirit was a plant?"
The silence that followed was suffocating. Laura looked at the book Martin had given her, a symbol of his blossoming love, and felt the crushing weight of the trap Lourdes had built. She was already too deep into the deception to leave without causing the very ruin she had run from on that freezing December night.
"I won't take any more information from you,"
Laura said quietly, her decision made.
"But God help us both when he finds out the truth. Because he will, Lourdes. Secrets of this size have a way of crumbling the foundations of everything they support."
The rain lashed against the windows of the Ashbourne House library, mirroring the storm raging within Laura. Martin stood by the fireplace, the warm glow of the embers catching the gold of his signet ring as he showed her a rare folio of Norman blueprints.
"I've spoken to your father again, Laura,"
Martin said, his voice thick with a shy, boyish joy that cut through her like a blade.
"I intend to make a formal proposal on Friday. I never thought I'd find a woman who looked at a blueprint with the same reverence I do. It feels like fate himself steered you into my life."
Laura looked at the blueprints, the very thing she loved, and felt they were tainted. The weight of the map in her mind became unbearable. She couldn't step into a marriage built on a foundation of sand.
"It wasn't fate, Martin,"
she whispered. Her voice was so low it was almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. Martin stilled, sensing the shift in the air.
"What do you mean?" "The night of the Peton ball,"
Laura began, her hands clenched so tightly in her skirts that her knuckles turned white.
"I didn't just happen to find a carriage. I ran from Earl Thornsby, yes, but the carriage I chose belonged to your sister. And lured, she didn't just offer me a ride. She offered me a role."
Martin's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew cold, the academic warmth vanishing instantly.
"A role? She was smiling when I got in, Martin. She saw a way to manage you. She gave me a map of your interests, told me which papers you'd read, told me about your passion
for the Henry VII Chapel. Even the spontaneous rescue from Lord Witherbe was a calculated move.
The words poured out of her now, a frantic, painful purging of the truth.
"I knew everything you liked before you ever opened your mouth. Our accidental meeting at the symposium was an orchestration."
The silence that followed was deafening. Martin stepped back, his shadow lengthening against the rows of ancient books. The vulnerability she had seen in the alcove was gone, replaced by the impenetrable, frozen mask of the Duke of Ashbourne.
"So,"
he said, his voice dangerously quiet,
"my sister needed a distraction to secure her own ends, and she found a willing actress in you. Was any of it real, Laura? Or was your interest in the drainage of Norwich Cathedral merely a well-rehearsed line?"
"It was real," Laura cried, stepping toward him, her eyes stinging with tears.
"That's why I'm telling you. I couldn't bear to hear you talk about our destiny when I knew I had an unfair advantage. I loved the architecture long before I met you, but I used that love as a weapon because I was desperate to be seen by someone like you. You didn't use it as a weapon, Laura. You used it as a snare."
Martin closed the folio with a definitive thud that echoed through the room.
"You and my sister have treated me like a structural problem to be solved rather than a man to be known. You've proven exactly why I was right to be guarded. Martin, please, leave us, Lady Laura,"
he said, turning his back to her to stare into the fire.
"I find I have no desire to discuss foundations today. It seems yours was built on a lie."
Laura fled the room, the sound of her own sobbing lost in the wind, leaving the Duke alone in a library that suddenly felt as cold and hollow as a tomb. For 2 weeks, the silence from Ashbourne House was absolute. Laura retreated to her father's library, surrounding herself with the cold comfort of parchment and ink, but the Gothic arches she loved now felt like the ribs of a cage. She had gained the honesty she craved, but at the cost of the man she loved. At Ashbourne House, Martin's
controlled fury
was a terrifying thing to behold. He moved through the halls like a winter storm, his staff whispering in his wake. He had torn up Lurd's
intelligence
notes, burning them in the grate of his study, and he refused to speak to his sister, who spent her days in tearful seclusion. But as the days turned into a fortnight, the anger began to settle into a cold, analytical clarity. Martin found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the sketches Laura had made during the symposium. He looked at her notes on the Norwich drainage, notes she had written before she ever met him. He looked at the way her mind had challenged his, pushing him to see structural solutions he had missed. He realized then that while the opportunity for their meeting had been manufactured, the substance of it had been entirely beyond Lured's control. Lurd could have told Laura what he liked, but she couldn't have taught Laura how to think. She couldn't have faked the way Laura's eyes lit up when discussing the tension of a flying buttress. The realization hit him with the force of a structural collapse. He had been so focused on the flawed foundation of their meeting that he had ignored the magnificent spire they had built upon it. He sent a single, unadorned note to the Garcia estate. Meet me at the Royal Society. The Westminster Folio is incomplete without your perspective. When Laura arrived at the lecture hall, she found it empty except for Martin. He was standing exactly where they had first sat, his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose as he studied a blueprint. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice was steady. Lurd is a meddling, strategic, and often unbearable sister, Martin said, finally looking at Laura. His eyes were no longer cold, but weary and searching. She gave you a map, Laura. But the map is not the journey. Martin, I burned the notes, he interrupted, stepping closer. Because I realized I didn't need them. I know you now. I know that you are the only person who has ever looked at the Duke of Ashbourne and seen the man who loves limestone and mathematics. If you had never entered that carriage, I would still be a ghost in my own life. He reached out, tentatively taking her hand. The beginning was a disaster of deception. But the compatibility, that was real. It was more real than anything I have ever known. Can we start over, Lady Laura? Without a map this time? Laura felt the weight finally lift, replaced by a hope so fierce it brought fresh tears to her eyes. I'd like that, she whispered. Starting with the transept, perhaps? Martin's lopsided smile returned, the one that reached his eyes. Starting with everything. The grand dining room of Ashbourne House was no longer a place of cold, ducal formality. Tonight, the candelabra glowed with a warmth that seemed to reflect the spirit of the four people gathered around the mahogany table. Martin sat at the head, but his focus was entirely on Laura, who was currently engaged in a heated and highly technical debate with Lord Philip Ravenswood about the industrial application of iron in modern bridges. Lurd sat beside Philip, her hand resting openly on his arm. The unsuitable man, whose fortune came from the textile trade, had won Martin over not with his ledgers, but with his integrity and his genuine support of Lurd's vibrant spirit. Martin had realized that if he could forgive a conspiracy born of love, he could certainly forgive a fortune born of hard work. I must admit, Martin, Lurd said, catching her brother's eye with a mischievous glint, my strategic romantic facilitation has yielded rather spectacular results. 2 weddings in one season is quite a feat, even for me. Please, Lurd, Martin said, though his voice was thick with affection. Do not give it a name. It was a disaster that happened to end in a miracle. It was a push, Laura corrected, reaching across to squeeze Lurd's hand. A messy, ethically dubious push that led us exactly where we needed to be. Flash forward, 5 years later. The summer sun bathed Ashbourne Castle in a golden hue, highlighting the ancient stone walls that Martin and Laura had spent years meticulously restoring together. The castle was no longer a monument to a stagnant past, but a living home. On the south lawn, a young boy with dark, unruly hair and his father's serious eyes was busy stacking small blocks of limestone. Thomas, if you place the weight there, the arch will collapse, Martin said, kneeling in the grass beside his son. He looked up as Laura approached, her hem stained with garden soil
and her hands full of architectural sketches.
Let him learn by empirical observation, Martin.
Laura laughed, leaning down to kiss her husband's cheek.
It's how the best architects started.
In the distance, a carriage rolled up the drive. A familiar face leaned out the window, lured, returning from London with Philip and news of their latest musical triumph. The wrong carriage, from that freezing December night, had long since been replaced by a life of right turns. As Martin watched his family, he realized that the map Lourdes had once drawn was nothing compared to the territory they had discovered together. The foundation had been rocky, and the beginning had been a scandal, but the structure they had built was permanent, purposeful, and, most importantly, authentic. Laura looked at the castle, then at her husband and son, feeling a bone-deep contentment. She had run from a cage and found a kingdom where her mind was prized as much as her heart. The Duke's sister had smiled, indeed, but it was Laura and Martin who had the last, happiest laugh.